Welcome to GrizzCast Dispatches, a new series hosted by the Grizzly Bear Foundation with urgent and informed conversations about developing stories affecting communities and grizzly bears wherever they may roam. Season 2 of GrizzCast with feature-length stories is coming soon. Until then, Dispatches will keep you connected as current events unfold. Let's begin.
So along the British Columbia coast, grizzly bears are on the move. Driven by innate biology and curiosity, changing food sources, human development, and the impacts of the climate crisis, as well as over 50 years of recovery efforts to restore the population in southwest BC. A little known fact, now that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is recovering, southwest BC is the most endangered grizzly bear recovery area in North America. So with this recovery comes grizzly bears wandering into unfamiliar places, raising questions about coexistence, conservation, and community safety. I'm Nicholas Scapillati, and in this episode of GrizzCast Dispatches, we'll follow the remarkable journey of one such bear, a young male who has been exploring communities and making his way up the Sunshine Coast since 2024, through the traditional territory of the Shíshálh and Tla'amin people. Tex, the most recent and perhaps most talked about grizzly bear on the move, Tex's story opens a window into the complexities of coexisting with wildlife and how provincial policies, Indigenous leadership, and community voices shape what happens next for this bear and others like him. Today, we are joined by BC Conservation Officer Sergeant Dean Miller. Dean, thanks for being here and welcome to GrizzCast Dispatches.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I like that opening. I like the opening about bear being driven by their biology. I've also heard that they're emboldened by their experiences.
Yeah, they're very intelligent animals, very curious. I think it's one of the reasons we're so fascinated by them. You know, I mentioned in the intro also about Southwest BC and the recovery of that area for grizzly bears. It's been happening since the hunt ended there in the 1970s. So you're the officer for that area, right? Can you describe us, which area you're responsible for?
Yeah, the Sunshine Coast zone is in the Region 2, the Lower Mainland region, and it extends from halfway up Howe Sound, and it goes all the way up Butte Inlet, which runs at about a parallel to Campbell River on Vancouver Island. And it encapsulates a lot of, mainland areas, inlets, fjords, and many, many islands in between. So it's a very dynamic and very logistically challenging zone for sure.
Yeah. Like, what's it like being the conservation officer for not only one of the most populated areas in the province, but like very complex geographically, but also this critical zone for grizzly bear recovery?
Yeah, it's dynamic for sure. Like I said, the logistics of the marine aspect of it. We have, lots of lakes we need to patrol as well, and quite remote areas that sometimes require us to, gather some funds in to get some helicopter patrols done. So we try to bring in lots of partnerships, of course, to do our jobs. We rely, heavily on volunteers and public information, to basically catch poachers, polluters, and, our public safety response to, large carnivore wildlife.
Right. So, coexistence is really at the heart of this conversation. Like, in your experience in this area, how prepared are the communities along the Sunshine Coast and these islands to coexist with bears?
I think coexistence has been, an increasing trend, and I'd like to, point a lot of credit to that, to the messaging from the CO service going back, like 20, 30 years, and delivering that message of not fear but awareness for sure. And I see it as a growing thing with the grizzly bear. recovery, we definitely have grizzly bears coming into places that they haven't been for, what the locals in these small towns have said, like, 60, 70 years, they haven't seen grizzly bears. So, it really is delivering a message that, grizzly bears, are basically the same response as a black bear in terms of what the public needs to do on their own property, on their businesses. And we're trying to do that. And I think we've had some success.
Yeah, you mentioned fear. It's a big part of, working grizzly bear conservation for us. A lot of people fear some in a healthy way, some in an unhealthy way. People also love grizzlies. And so, like in your experience, have you seen that sort of attitude change toward bears and people not being as fearful or understanding that they're going to have to coexist? Or do you still think there's a lot of work that needs to be done?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get percentages of society, and the thing that's occurring now is, we are moving humans around, and there's a lot of interest in, more wild spaces by, people that come from urban areas or come from other parts of the world. And so, there's always going to be an influx in new people, and which means more education for sure. And then you have the long-term residences that have never had a conflict with wildlife, with large carnivore wildlife, and it just, for the first time in like 40 years, they have a conflict based on a bird feeder or an unclean barbecue or a freezer that they've always kept on their porch because their house is, considerably smaller than most. And so there's still that random nature to these wildlife conflicts, right?
Yeah, still a lot of work to do. I guess that's the truth about conservation is that the work is never done. There's always the next generation, or like you said, new people moving in. So we just have to keep having that conversation and preparing communities. You mentioned partnerships, and I think that's really interesting. That helps you do your work in this age of reconciliation with the province and First Nations, and they're beginning to discuss co-management of these lands. What has been your experience on working on the ground with the Shíshálh Nation? For example, last year you helped relocate this young male grizzly bear, which people are calling Tex. He showed up in Gibsons and Shíshálh, and you relocated him twice, and he was in Pender Harbor as well. How has that relationship worked with the nation?
Well, we're lucky on the Sunshine Coast because the Shíshálh Nation gets funded by the federal and provincial government, and for a natural resource program. So we've developed relationships with these longtime workers at their natural resource department. And so, I can't speak much about bears because there hasn't been a lot of work there, but there's definitely a co-understanding about the objectives there. Yeah.
So this young male who was relocated twice last year, could you just, for the public to really understand what's involved in an operation like that, can I ask you a few questions about that? Like, where do you start? Is it with policies and procedures, or what informs your decision that this bear should be relocated?
Well, of course, it's policies and procedures, definitely. But of course, every situation is not the same. It's not homogenous type work where you can kind of plug and play every single thing you do. So in the case like this, we of course make our phone calls to our provincial wildlife biologists. We explain the situation because we're, of course, the responding field agency. So most of the time we are supplying, other government workers with the actual information, and they help us make, an informed, ethical, logical, safety-driven decision.
Right.
And so when we have a grizzly bear that shows up first in Port Mellon, and then it beelines itself to Langdale, and then it's seen in a very urban area in Gibsons, and is not necessarily displaying a lot of fear of humans. I mean, special considerations have to be made. And you also have to consider the fact that coastal grizzly bear populations are quite fragile. And so, I mean, it is a bear. It's a bear, like a black bear is a bear, but because it's, a special species considering, those low numbers in population. I mean, you need to work collaboratively to make the right decision.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's important for people to know that it's not just the COS, but you're working closely with the provincial wildlife branch and their biologists to interpret these situations and make these decisions.
Yeah, and a lot of times you're doing it on the fly because you're driving to respond to the animal actually being, in these urban areas, and then and you're making probably 20 phone calls in an hour to school districts, to RCMP, to old age homes, to businesses, ensure that the public is informed about this animal. And you're also consulting with, of course, the biologist to make the best decision for the situation.
Yeah, that paints a really good picture of what the community safety part of your job looks like. But then also, the conservation part, like you mentioned, this is a recovery area for grizzly bears. Like, how does an operation like that come together, and how does it unfold?
So in the case of the first interaction with this grizzly bear in Gibsons, I mean, we were trying to figure out the best possible way after we established that, hey, this is a young bear. We don't know it. We don't have a history of it getting into conflict. I think the reports went back maybe 2 days prior to the time that we had darted it or immobilized it and moved it. So we didn't have any reason to believe that it had ever done anything, concerning safety, other than the fact that it just was in the public eye, and it was, basically in the midst of a busy urban area in Gibsons. Like sometimes these immobilization efforts are tricky for officers. So, we eventually, we use our partnership with the RCMP to help us out with our officer safety. And we found the bear in a very small patch of trees, right down, basically downtown Gibsons, right across from the elementary school. And fortunately, with a lot of, coaching on what to do, because you don't know it could be an unpredictable situation if you deploy one of these, immobilization darts, what the bear is going to do. You don't want it to, run out into traffic as well too. So you're considering all that. And I know we take into consideration, if we're doing free range mobilization around water sources as well too, what could all happen. So luckily we deployed, and we were able to immobilize the bear, and we used the RCMP to quickly load it into a vehicle, and then we had to, of course, transfer it into a bear trap, a live trap, for safe transportation.
Right. It's interesting. The next step really is, once you've got it in the trap, is how do you determine a relocation site? Is that done with the government, like the wildlife branch?
Yeah, with the biologist.
Yeah.
So the conversation with the biologist was really great because, he was able to basically say, well, we are in a salmon window, and, I know of, basically good elk numbers. So it's food based, right? Like bears are very food driven, of course. And so if you have that conversation and establish good habitat, I know people get stuck on this distance thing, and but really it comes down to habitat, because we've always known we've had grizzly bear populations in the Coahome, Salmon Inlet area, which is really as straight as a crow flies. It's maybe maybe 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers from Gibson's.
Wow.
And so if you have that kind of habitat to sustain a bear, that bear will stay there, hopefully. So, we established an area that was far enough away. And then, of course, I said the fish window and having, a supply of ungulate food sources and whatnot in an area that's not active by, logging, and doesn't get a lot of recreational activities as well. So we found an ideal spot to put that bear. Right. But unfortunately, that bear was so driven to come back that essentially it took about 3 weeks, and then that bear was in downtown Shíshálh. And it's quite a risky situation because the bear walked through downtown Shíshálh, it walked through the banned lands, and then it was going along Davis Bay. And I think there's a picture that, the fur bearers have put out, and that was maybe taken by the public. But what that picture doesn't depict is that, of course you have lots of traffic and lots of looky-loos on the side. So we were walking beside that bear, trying to almost corral it, keep it on the beach. And, so because it was walking, heading south, and we didn't want it to dart across the highway. So we didn't do anything at that point until it got into some parkland, a bit more space, and we were able to again immobilize it and move it one more time and move it to a different spot, but still again with the same principles of the food sources, fish window, water source, and all that kind of stuff.
So you mentioned he was didn't really show any signs of getting into trouble when he was in Gibson's, but he was in an area that's very urban. And it's close to, a community with a school and things like that. Was the same true for Shíshálh? Did he get into any conflicts, or is he, just curious, maybe a little bit bratty, wrong place, wrong time?
Maybe he did, but we did not receive any reports of that.
Right.
So there wasn't anything for us to believe that he was, of course we classify bears into food condition and human habituated. And I would say that just his behavior was very, very human habituated. But not food condition, not that we can determine. Of course, there's apples on fruit on trees that time of year. And of course there's garbage sources and whatnot.
Right. Yeah. I've heard the COS described, first as a public safety organization, but also a conservation organization. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, for a minute? What does that mean when you approach these situations, and how do you determine if a situation is, at risk of public safety?
Well, it's behavior led, right? It's bear behavior led. And so, there's definitely some behaviors that bears can get into and have gotten into that lead into potential for, situations that could threaten public safety. And it's not just, the potential for a bear physically contacting a person that creates a safety issue. It's also having them in proximity to people that could create injury to residents. I.e., if you have a bear so food conditioned to a neighborhood, for instance, and this bear has no issue and no fear of getting on people's porches or their stairwells, and it creates a situation where somebody is on the same stairwell and gets surprised and falls, right?
Yeah.
That's a situation that just, I think it's preventable for sure. And I think that, I think the public needs to be definitely aware with all the cause effects of having bears in urban areas. It's not ideal. We definitely want bears to be feeding on natural food sources for sure.
And, You've given us a really good insight into not only your job, but different types of, these situations that are, coexistence situations, but also, conservation and public. It's really been great to have this in-depth conversation with you. I guess my last question for you is, in many areas, grizzly bears are visiting for the first time. This is the first time people are seeing grizzly bears in their community.
Mm-hmm.
But as we said at the top of the program, grizzlies are on the move. This is going to be a continuing trend. What do people need to understand when it comes to coexisting with grizzly bears, especially in areas where grizzlies don't often roam?
Well, what we have recommended, if you're not bear safe now, if you're not practicing those bear safe principles now, you really should take a walk around your property and all outside areas and kind of amplify what you're doing, considering that, this species, this grizzly bear is a fragile population. And the fact that, you should really, when there is a grizzly bear around, you should take extra care to both protect yourself and protect that bear from becoming food conditioned, from becoming a danger to yourself, your kids, your neighbor, your local, school fields and all that kind of stuff. So it's that shared responsibility. It's also really the principles don't change from a black bear, which, people in these communities, especially on the Sunshine Coast, have gotten used to, the coexistence. There's lots of volunteer groups that have put out really good messaging. Our Wild Safe organization has put out great messaging as well, too. So
that's a great point.
Most people understand those principles, but hey, these grizzly bears coming in and the recovery that's happening really should be a reminder to the public that, we emphatically need to, protect our properties from bear intrusion and bears getting into food sources, our food sources, unnatural food sources.
Yeah. Well, Sergeant Miller, I really appreciate you taking the time. This is part of a 3-story arc where we've been talking to the Shíshálh First Nation, bear biologists, and now the Conservation Officer Service to get a deeper insight on not only what's happening for Tex, this grizzly bear on Texada Island, but how this is happening in communities all over southwestern BC and on Vancouver Island. And just a great discussion on how we can further coexistence and get prepared for living with grizzly bears. Appreciate your time, and thanks for being here for GrizzCast Dispatches.
For sure. Yeah, thanks for talking to me today. I sure appreciate you getting this messaging out.
Thanks for listening to GrizzCast Dispatches. This report is the third in a mini-series exploring the story of Tex. If you missed the first 2 episodes with biologist Dr. Lana Ciernello and Eric Blaney from the Tla'amin Nation, we encourage you to listen today. Subscribe to GrizzCast and don't miss out on future dispatches.
GrizzCast is hosted by the Grizzly Bear Foundation, a charitable organization solely dedicated to the welfare and conservation of grizzly bears. Support our work by making a donation at grizzcast.grizzlybearfoundation.com and get on our mailing list. This episode was produced by Lindsay Marie Stewart and Sarah Vickruck. Music composed by ALO. Sound editing and voiceover by Sarah Vickruck. Nicholas Scapillati is the executive producer and host of GrizzCast. Season 2 of GrizzCast is coming soon, so stay connected. Please share and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.